My background is I've worked in both private sector, doing environmental consultant out in Calgary. Both my bachelor's, my master's, and my PhD were all GIS based. They've not been in GIS fields. Urban planning was my bachelor's and master's at University of Waterloo, and my PhD is in sociology from University of Texas. So I use GIS as a tool for doing analysis. And I've done analysis on social inequality, I've done analysis on crime, I've done analysis on environment, well siting, biodiversity, and most recently over the last 6 years, I've been doing a lot of research on health inequalities, both using GIS explicitly, so doing spatial analyses, and implicitly, where it's part of the research process. So you can use a GIS within your research process without it actually having look like you're doing it in your actual outcomes. And I'll talk a little bit about that, what we're doing. So this is our new structure. What we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of lecture on what is GIS. Some of you have a basic understanding of what GIS. Really, geographic information asks 3 questions: what, where, and why. And the concept of space is essential to geography. Where is what located and why? Where is the locational attribute? So where can be any number of things in terms of attribute location. It can be a text-based name. It can be a coordinate in space. It can be an address. It can be any number of things. What is the attribute? So what are we looking at? Is this a crime event? Is this a traffic event? Is this a death or a cancer incident? And why is analytical? So why is this event happening where it is? So these are questions that we answer with geographic information. So almost everything that we can talk about in all these different fields that we are happens somewhere. And in most cases, knowing where these things happen is critically important. And we can answer a whole new set of questions by understanding where things are happening and by asking a new set of spatially based questions, geographically informed questions. So some of the things that we can use it for are the positional electoral districts. This is going to become a very big issue within Canada as we renegotiate the boundaries for the federal election boundaries. Statistics Canada is involved in that, but it becomes a political issue as to how we cut our boundaries. And in the United States, we've seen huge impacts on the US elections because of boundary changing, most notably in Texas, where you saw that happening. Location of hospitals and health events. This is also a big thing in New Brunswick, where we have rationalization of healthcare and closing of regional hospitals and consolidation of services. How is that affecting some of the health outcomes and health inequalities and health in general of New Brunswickers? Routing delivery vehicles and school buses. How are our kids getting to school? What's the most important way? How UPS delivers trucks. They're all sent out by GPS. How Amazon employees pack your bags. They all have these. You guys see that in the media lately? Salon.com had on that. Apparently they're the most overworked employee of any of the corporations. And they're managed to the second as to how they're doing. They have a little box on them that tells them, walk over here, grab this item, walk over here, grab this item. They're all mapped by GIS. It's a routing system that they're using. There you go. Not always for good. Management of forest stands, allocation of funds for flood protection, something else that's very important here in New Brunswick. So geographic informations are a special class of informations that track events, activities, things, as well as where these events, activities, and things happen or exist. This is essentially our formal definition of what it is. Geographic location is an important attribute of activities, policies, strategies, and plans. So when we're developing, a lot of you say that you're in strategic planning or in policy ends, a lot of policy areas, a lot of what you're talking about in terms of policies is enacted on a spatial level, whether it's a health region level, a health unit level, school level, traffic planning area, forest management area, environmental management area. All these things happen in places. So we can use geographic problems, solve an aspect of location, whether the information is used to solve them or in the solution themselves. So whenever I teach a session on Introduction to GIS, I talked about Dr. John Snow. How many people know the John Snow story? Epidemiologists, raise your hands. So it's a fairly well-known thing. He's known as the father of modern epidemiology and as the father of GIS. So in the 1850s, cholera was really poorly understood. And one of the last great cholera outbreaks occurred in London in 1954 in the Soho district. And the deaths occurred within an area of streets. But how these deaths were occurring was really poorly not known. One of the most common explanation for cholera at the time was something called miasma. Right before the cholera epidemic in 1954, there was the sort of the fog caused by industrial activity, the heavily polluted fog. And the thought was that there was something in this fog in the air. It was an unhealthy air, this miasma, that caused cholera. And it's a very rational explanation when you think about it. However, Dr. John Snow noticed that the outbreak appeared to be centered, so he was visiting clients who were infected with cholera and noticed that these were infected upon one water pump, were centered around one water pump, the Broad Street pump. And it was a public drinking water. And his hypothesis was then that cholera was not spread by miasma in the air, but was in fact spread by water. There's a lot more to the story that I'm glossing over. There's a couple of books on it. Stephen Johnson wrote a very good book about it. And so that there's anomalies in the sense that the deaths occurred in households located closer to the source of the water. And he's able to confirm those, that all these households where cholera was present, everyone drew the water from the Broad Street pump. And he mapped this out with number of cases of deaths by household with the location of the pump in the middle. So they had the handle of the pump removed and the outbreak subsided. So the Broad Street pump replica exists there today, and the curbstone and the capped water pipe are still there right behind the John Snow pub. So if you're ever in London, go for a pint at the John Snow pub. So he's considered the father of GIS, even though he didn't use computers for his analysis. It was a map from the city. It wasn't even him that actually ended up mapping it. It was someone else, I forget the fellow's name, who worked at the city, who mapped these locations of the deaths and mapped it out. But it was one of the first instances, along with the London poverty map very soon afterwards, that translated public health information into a spatial manner and spatially examined a public health outbreak. So it's a geographic information system. We had events that were in space with attributes, deaths, and of timing of them when they occurred attached to them, which is really what geographic information systems is all about. So the process of geographic inquiry, which was done by John Snow and is still done today, is first we ask a question. So what is the pattern to when and where crime is occurring? What is the pattern to when and where cholera events are occurring? So we obtain the necessary data from relevant sources. In John Snow's case, this was deaths from cholera. And they are tied to addresses and when they occurred. So we could then know when they occurred. And even knew, was it the mother, was it the children, who was it that they occurred? We can then visualize and explore the data, exploratory data analysis. We can plot this on a map. We can do all sorts of different ways. We could also just view it in a table in terms of the numbers and the addresses. But the visual analysis adds something else to it. So we can then act on those results. And the acting on this result was the removal of the pump at Broad Street. And we can do similar things in the type of analysis. So it's a process of geographic inquiry. So approximately 80%, roughly, non-scientific, 80% of all statistics are made up. So no. This was Longley and their book on GIS. They source this number. But 80% of government data is associated with some spatial location. Usually an address, a postal code, a service area, some sort of identifier which provides it some sort of geographic element to it. The information also is the attributes or characterizations to provide insight into the location. So this data has other things attached to it. Any sheet that an individual fills out when they come into the government or information on an individual will have their name and address usually, or something, other identifier which provides that, and then whatever the information is. So whatever other event they are. When we make planning, we often do planning the same way. We attach a geographic into that. So the system would be the operation linkage of linking the information to the geography. and it's the process by which we link those. So broadly speaking, a GIS is a computer-based system that includes the software. It includes the hardware, the software being, ArcGIS or something like that, or Excel, Microsoft Access, any other sort of database type software. Includes the hardware used to store it. Sometimes for web mapping, this can include a web mapping server. The software could include your Google Chrome or, heaven forbid, Internet Explorer browser. The people using it, and the people constructing the data, and then the geographic information themselves. So it's not just the software itself. A GIS is not just ArcGIS. It's like saying statistics is SAS. Statistics is SPSS. It's not, right? GIS is this broad-based system, and it's a set of analyses, and it's a set of processes that exist within this sort of environment. So we're going to look at just some things related to this. And it's also not just for making maps. Maps are one part of it, and it's one of the most powerful parts of it is visualization. And it's one of the sort of main outputs we can get. But it's not just the mapping itself. So GIS can be a computerized tool. It's a spatial decision support system. It can aid us in making decisions. It can provide us a different set of alternatives, what we can do. It's an inventory of geographically distributed features. It's a method for revealing patterns. It's a tool to automate time-consuming tasks. It's a collection of hardware, software. It's all these sort of different things. It's also a multi-billion-dollar industry. So Esri is the largest of them, and it's a privately held company. But they are quite good. The Canadian president of Esri is a graduate of UNB, so, and a New Brunswicker. So it's actually not that bad. There are a number of GIS systems, so broader systems in terms of the software available. So these range from high-powered analytical software, the Esri ArcGIS system, to visual web applications. So web-based GIS, someone mentioned the Newfoundland community mapping. They've got a really good example. Community account in Newfoundland. It's quite good. And that's one of them. Brampton, City of Brampton has a really good one. University of Waterloo does because they've got a great geography department there. They do it for free for them, right? So GeoBrowser, Google Earth, Google Maps, you guys have all used that. There's lots of stuff you can do with Google Maps. When you type in your directions, how do I get from here to there? That's a spatial analysis that it's doing, right? And it now tells you traffic flow and estimated time and things like that. So it's route, doing your route, figuring out what the traffic patterns are, figuring out the approximate time. So all these are spatial processes and spatial analysis. And then desktop GIS, ArcGIS. OpenGIS is a free GIS software that has a lot of stuff in it. Geoda is something that we're going to be using as well. So there are sort of free things. Have any questions so far? Some of this is going to be kind of dry, and it's going to, I'm glossing over a lot of it, but I want to give people a little bit of a broader introduction to what is this thing that you're talking about and what is GIS before.
Will your slides be available?
Yep. Yep, my slides are, later on you're going to log into a Dropbox account that Mike set up and download the stuff onto the computer. And you can either just grab all the stuff right now. All the stuff I'm using is freely available data that I've, from StatsCan and from New Brunswick and things like that. And you can also take the presentation and the lab and things like that. Those are all available on there. And the Geoda software I've also included on there too. So if you have a memory stick, you can bring it. We're going to have it again tomorrow. So if you have a memory stick tomorrow, don't have one today, you can bring it tomorrow. And if you want this, I can just email it to you as well. So GIS data. GIS data are a sort of a special type of data, and they're different than what normally when we think of data are. Normally when we think of data, it might be an identifier which has a selection of information. So if we think of census data, right? Maybe we have census data in a neighborhood, a dissemination area, a census tract, a city. It has information associated with percent of people in low income, percent of people with COPD, Or it might be an individual, whether or not they have a particular disease, whether or not they've been screened, when was the last time they visited the physician, these sort of things. Or survey data, a survey identifier, and then the various questions we ask them based on that. The geographic data have something, are a combination of these things. So they have a latitude, longitude, which sits within a national coordinate system. So it could be part of the national coordinate system. It could be an address. So it could be your physical postal address, which is a very poor geographic identifier, by the way. A district, whatever you're in, a wetland identifier, a road name, any of these sort of things. It's sort of a spatial data. It's different from other types of information, and therefore this whole GIS science exists behind it to deal with it. First of all, it's multidimensional. You need at least 2 coordinates to define a location. You need something to look, a location in space is an X and a Y, and sometimes a Z as well for an elevation. It's voluminous. Geographic database can easily reach a terabyte in size. Geographic data is huge because it's the spatial data, the spatial information data, plus the attribute data associated with it. So it includes all these different things about it. Different representations, we can look at it differently, and I'll give you some examples. We're essentially taking an element that's either a point or a line or an area, and we're placing it onto a spheroid of the Earth and making a mathematical representation of this. It requires the projection onto a flat surface when we have a map, a computer screen, or something like that, and it requires unique analysis methods as a result. There's this whole scientific and mathematical methodology that goes behind what you see on the screen for mapping. And it requires us to integrate these different data sources. So it's a fairly complex system that underlies what we're eventually seeing in terms of the data. So what you're going to get are some very simplistic data with a few attributes associated with it. But behind the scenes is a whole nother layer of complexity that exists to be able to get all these different things. So GIS is a digital representation of the real world. So we have this real world, in quotes, what we see here, a city which has buildings and rivers and roads and pathways and bridges and people, that the land is used by certain types of land use. There's elevation, there's hills on there, there's land parcels with property and property information associated with that. There's streets, and there's customers or events or individuals that are on there as well, or those could be building points and things like that. So all of these different layers exist within a digital representation of the real world. And each one of these things is represented in a different manner and is treated differently when we go to analyze them spatially and to map them. Raster, we're going to get into that in a little bit. There's 2 types of GIS data. One is vector. So vector you can think of as a point, a line, or a polygon. So it's either linear. Raster is like a cell, like a grid-based system, where you have essentially squares or a matrix. For those of you who've ever done matrix algebra, it's essentially a matrices, an X and a Y, and each one of those cells has a value associated with this. In this case, land usage. So I'm going to get into that in a little bit. It's 2 types of data that you can have within a GIS, and both are useful in different situations, and you can integrate them and do different things with each one. So within a GIS, we end up with this system where we have a layer here. This is the census subdivisions of New Brunswick, which are approximately municipal boundaries, roughly here and there, counties. It's harder than rural areas. Each one of these then has an attribute information associated with this. So this spatial element, in this case a polygon, has some information associated with us. It tells us the name, the type it is, what province, the province's name, the census division name, etc. All these things that exist in there. It can tell us the population count, the land area, the perimeter of it, and things like that. So all of that, and those things are dynamically linked within the GIS. So we can click on the map, see one element, and then get the associated tabular information. or we can link tabular information to the spatial information and do that within there. And we can bring in other data that we want via this system of either spatially or via an identifier system, a common identifier system. So getting to your question of the raster, spatial data are made of layers for locations, and these are composed of two different things, either features or surfaces. Features are discrete objects, buildings, roads, rivers. Each feature has an attribute, the name for the road, parcel number, census data associated with it. Surfaces, this is the raster base. They're numeric and continuous, and this is such as topography, temperature, air pressure, air pollution. It is something that we look at over top of the whole system. So when you look at a temperature map for North America, you see these curves that, these highs and lows and things like that. That's actually a surface. It's a continuous surface you can see modeled. An elevation map shows the same way. That's what you would call a surface. And it covers the whole area versus just a discrete object like a building footprint. So, and these are spatially referenced in different ways. Points are a set of XY coordinates. Very simple. It has an X and a Y. So just like when you plot things on a graph, it tells us where it is. How that X and Y is defined is fairly complex, and we'll get into that. But those can be the locations of crime, accidents, air monitoring stations, stores. Lines, or arcs, it's from and to. These can be roads, rivers, and utilities. These can have a whole bunch of information associated with them. What lines essentially are a collection of points. So when we create a line within a GIS, what we actually do is we actually calculate 1 point, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and we follow that line all the way along. And then we numerically smooth it to make it look like it's smooth, or we keep it jagged like that. But it's a collection of points is what it is. And it goes from one area to one area. It has a right side and a left side, similar to what you would have a road, right? Like, your addresses are even on one side, odd on the other. So a line would have that information in it, going from point A to point B. So it can have that sort of information in it. Polygons are a series of connected lines, where we have lines that are connected and start and stop in the same location. So these are provinces, health regions, school districts, what have you. You can think of any number of features that could be polygons, building footprints, tables, I don't know, all these sort of things. You guys learned your shapes on Sesame Street. I don't need to go into it. So spatial data is stored within a system as a collection of discrete objects, each of which has a spatial reference. So within this database, each spatial object, each census subdivision, each point is stored as a separate line in the database. Similar to you would have within a survey or an Excel, each event has its own line. The same thing as it's stored within a GIS. Each element has its own line. Each line has its own record. Each polygon has its own record. And it's this collection of it that we get. And we visualize these discrete entities. And it can either be implemented through a vector or raster data models. The vector data model is like a series of polygons. This is the southern United States. This is the county of Brewster, Texas. It has selected right here. It has a series of attribute information on it. It tells us what state and what information it is. But it's a polygon linked to an attribute table. Raster data model is a grid, each of which has a cell value. So the light blue might be 1, a river with agricultural on the side, with a city and forested area around it. And these cells can be of any size. So they can be a cell that is, in this case, maybe it's 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. So we have a city that is within here, so it's a very coarse grid. It can be as any size you want, down 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, 1 meter by 1 meter. Depends on how detailed data you have and what scale you're doing things at. So we have air pollution surfaces of Canada that are at 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer, approximate values of particulate matter and overall air pollution. We have other air pollution models for cities, like for Montreal, that is approximately 50 meter by 50 meter. So it's much smaller, part of a block. And each one of these has a value then associated with this, with a width and a height and a series of properties that tell us what neighbor it's associated with. So some more that you need to know about spatial data, and I'm not gonna expect you to understand this and remember it, but I want you to understand that there's the science that underlies it. Spatial data has this playoff between precision and accuracy, and that is based upon the geographic science that underlies it. Basically, the projection that your data is, the datum in the coordinate system, how you define where it is in space. So most of you have probably seen these types of maps. These are different projections of the world. This is the most common type of map that we have. We can make the world look different ways depending upon what projection we use. And a lot of our maps look, and how we interpret it depends on this. Greenland looks absolutely massive here compared to Australia, same as here, and Antarctica is massive. So it changes how we view the world. And in a country like Canada, this can become really important because we've got such a large land area. So when you're viewing the country as a whole, it can be quite difficult. A province like New Brunswick, we're actually pretty lucky here because we've got a relatively square-looking province that's kind of small. So in terms of mapping, it's quite handy. Mapping all of Canada is really difficult. Most people live in this tiny little band at the very bottom. The Maritime's tucked down there. Southern Ontario is a tiny little blip that thinks it's the center of it. But all the population sits there. And then this large expanse of north where there's very little people. So issues of representation can be quite a challenge. Datum. This is how we determine what position it is. For those of you who know anything about the world, we know that it's not a circle, that it's actually a spheroid, and it's not an even spheroid at that. And how it sits depends upon how we think of it. So what our reference point, where we start measuring the Earth, has a huge impact on what our coordinates are in space and how distance is measured. So we can't actually just take, one of the common mistakes people do on GIS is they have an XY coordinate, let's say downtown Fredericton, and an XY coordinate of St. John, and we'll say, well, easy, I can find out how long it is between there, right? This part and this part, we know it's just, especially if you have an UTM, it's in meters. Let's just do a simple division and find that out. But that's not the case, right? Because the Earth changes. Over a small distance like Fredericton to St. John, it's not a big deal, but distance between Fredericton and Montreal becomes a bigger deal because the Earth is curved. So, let alone you have to actually travel on roads, that's a whole other issue. But roads also go up and down. So how we do this has a big impact on what we're doing. So this is part of why GIS exists, in that if we want to calculate things like distance, we need to do it within these systems, and we need to define our data correctly. And we need to know how our data is defined. You have a whole department in the government of New Brunswick that does this, and they've won actually some pretty, I noticed, I was just poking around on the NB-IRDT website over the last couple of weeks while I was preparing for this. And they won in 2013, they won an award from ESRI Canada, ESRI actually in national. I think they went down to California to receive the award for best data warehouse and best data program. And it was, NB-IRDT won that. So it was, as a province, be recognized within North America as one of the leaders in producing data and making it available is pretty good. And there's a large amount of data that's available on that website. And this is projection, and you guys probably know you guys know this, and this is how we calculate our XY coordinates. A lot of what we're going to be doing is in what's called decimal degrees. So it's the conversion of the latitude, longitude degrees into a decimal format. And there is a conversion for that. So this is sort of how we do it, and you'll be looking at that in your data set. So now I'm going to actually get into what is geographical analysis. So I'm going to give you some examples of what is spatial analysis and what are spatial relationships and how we can construct some of these geographic questions. I'm done with the data part for today. Okay, done with that stuff. It's a little bit boring. And we're going to be doing some of these things within our analysis. When we do the hands-on analysis, we're going to be looking at that. So some of the spatial topological relationships that we use in our everyday language, but we don't necessarily think of as a geographic thing. So, you know, belongs. New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI belong to the Maritimes, right? The Maritimes are comprised of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI, right? So these are spatial relationships. The spatial entity called the Maritimes is comprised of these three geographic entities, which are, you know, political, administrative, but they exist in space. The city of Fredericton is located in New Brunswick. So the point that we can say, the dot, when we look at a map of Fredericton, is located inside. And we're going to be doing that in our analysis. We're going to be locating things within inside other things. New Brunswick borders Nova Scotia, but not PEI. It's connected to PEI, but it doesn't border it, right? So we could then select this polygon that is New Brunswick, and we could say, find all provinces that border New Brunswick, provinces or states. PEI wouldn't show up unless we were looking at roads. Then it would show up some of the time when it's not closed. Fredericton to St. John is 110 kilometers, is a certain distance from. Fredericton is within 125 kilometers of the US border. So we can use these different things. How many individuals, we're looking at changing the healthcare, health services within rural New Brunswick and closing a health center. How many individuals live within 50 kilometers of this health center? If we close it, now how many individuals have to drive more than 1 hour to visit a health clinic? These are questions we can answer, you know, with a geographic information system. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of GIS functions. How am I doing for time? Excellent. I tried to speed this up. Some basic I'm going to go through some basic and some advanced GIS functions. Basic, distance. How long is it from this road to this road? Distance is 0.2977 miles in this case, spherical based on the spheroid of the Earth. So, you know, how this object here, this lake, what is the total area and perimeter? What is it composed of? How many line segments and how many polygons? What is the center? What is this extent? What is the center of this lake? Well, its bottom part is up here. Its top part is here. You know, rightmost, leftmost. Its center is not in the lake. We can say, okay, the spatial center is there, but if we want the spatial center within the lake, it's actually right there. So that's the centroid, is what it's called. The centroid of a polygon. And that can be very important in your analysis. And that's a word that you might not have heard, but that's what the centroid is. Some more basic functions that we do, and we can translate these into plain language. So intersecting different features. We have a land parcel layer on one hand, and maybe this is a buffer of a schools or something like that. You know, how many are within 50 meters of these schools? We can then select out that portion and just have then that portion. What's the portions that within that school boundary of that area? And we can do that spatially within the ArcGIS. Overlay, we can then combine these two features so that we can not only combine them spatially, so we have the spatial extents of this square, these rectangles, and this circle, but we also get the associated attributes, right? So this is A, B, and C, right? So if we were to do it that way, and this is A, B, and C, right? This would have the attributes of A and C, and this would be B and C. So if we were to look at our attribute table, it would have, this record would only have the attributes of A, this only of B. This would have the attributes of both, and then this of just C, right? So we could actually combine the tabular data in behind it as well. Now, on this, we could obviously do it just by looking at it. I mean, it's not that difficult. But if you think of an entire city and you look at all elementary schools, and you want to look at the area within each elementary school catchment area, well, there's a lot of schools, a lot of properties within New Brunswick, within Fredericton. How are we going to combine these data? Well, it does it all automatically for you. So it can then associate all the schools information with each of the land parcel information automatically through this type of system. Buffer. We can take each of these points, lines, or these areas, these polygons, and we can buffer them a certain distance. We can grow them out a certain distance, however we want to do it. So we can either grow it out so they stay as discrete entities, or we can combine these lines and it becomes one solid blob, whether we want to do that or not. So either they can keep their original attributes, where we could say these areas are bounded by both, or we can just combine them. Or we can draw a line down the middle and say, okay, well, that's the halfway between point. So this is a good way of doing catchments and things like that, creating catchment areas. Another thing we can do is what's called a spatial join. That's where you're matching rows from one layer to a target layer in another spatial entity. So here I have an example of all the points that are within these polygons. So these 2 points also are linked to this polygon attribute. These 2 points are linked to this polygon attribute. So we can then link our tables based on where they're located in space. We're going to do this one as well. Some more advanced things that we can do. Some of the people who do any sort of traffic planning and things like that, or regional planning, you can do, or healthcare planning. You can do shortest path. What's the shortest path from an incident to the hospital? Police use these, ambulances use these, fire departments use these all the time. 911 dispatchers often have a system like this. I don't know if they do here in New Brunswick. Probably do. Routing. We have a call. We have 3 vehicles. We have a series of calls. Which vehicle can respond to which calls within the shortest time? How do we allocate those things out? Location allocation. We have students who are going to be attending primary school this year. How do we allocate them to the number of seats available in each school, right? This school has more seats available. This is smaller. So how do we allocate these things? Looks pretty cool. I think people would be impressed if you had a map for that, showing where you're going to be allocated. Of course, it's never as neat as that because parents always want to send their kids to a school cross boundary, out of boundary. I have 3 kids. I know exactly what that's about. We can also find out information about what's adjacent to it. So here we have an enumeration area, which is like a city block type thing that used to exist at StatsCan. We can find out how many other enumeration areas touch it, how many touch those ones, how many touch those ones. So we can look at different orders of neighbors. So one of the ways that they do this is for siting of liquor stores is a big thing that they do, is how many people are going to be within a certain distance of liquor stores. How many schools are going to be within walking distance. Liquor stores can't be close to schools, particularly high schools. Apparently it doesn't matter for universities. They probably want to locate them closer to university because it's their main source of income. I don't know. But usually there's legislation governing that sort of thing. Another thing that we can do with GIS is we can look at the spatial relationships. So here we have lung cancer, and we have lung cancer mortality for the white population within the United States. In the United States, it's all white and black. Everything's based on colors. Doing my PhD there, that's just, you get used to talking about that. And so we can then produce maps and we can say, okay, let's look at lung cancer mortality and let's look at it by the square root of the population. And we can find out areas where we have lower than expected lung cancer mortality and areas where we have higher than expected lung cancer mortality. So we can then see spatially, okay, we have lung cancer hotspots. you know, and this cancer hotspot analysis has become pretty de rigueur, I should say, you know, pretty fashionable as of late, particularly in Canada. They've done a lot of work done looking at these cancer hotspots for various things, and where you would have these sort of things. And as a public health, you know, people working in public health, you might really want to look at something like this and say, okay, in New Brunswick, where are the hotspots of certain types of cancers? And this isn't just, you know, where are the most cancer cases, but where are we getting higher than expected value, higher than expected concentrations of high values? And so there's something different that's occurring in these areas that is causing these. And it might be an area then to look at for intervention. And if you have limited resources, as any government does have limited resources to spend on this type of prevention, you know, we then might want to focus our resources on there and sort of get the most bang for the buck. Yeah?
How would you add in something like time? Like if that's a retirement zone, your deaths due to cancer could also just be a 25.
You can do it. You can do it based on standardized rates as well. There's certain ways you can do it based on standardized rates. So I'm not sure. This is just quite honestly, this is an example I pulled out of the example book that we're going to use tomorrow. And they'll provide us that workbook I'm going to provide for tomorrow's labs has specific functions that used for standardized rates. We can do it based on age. We can also do it based on time, right? So within certain years, what is the change in rates? What is the change in this? So how has that changed over time? And there's even functions you can have to animate that change from one map to the other. You need that corresponding data that goes behind it, but we may have that already, right? So let's look, you know, we group 3-year periods of lung cancer, and we calculate an age standardized rate by district, and then we can look at these rates over time and how they've changed. So this is something that we can do. Yeah, Luke?
Just a question about, is there a function where this map is kind of tilted and then we can see some sort of elevation in the sense that
Yeah.
When I was mapping stuff, I was mapping, for example, charitable organization in the city. Well, it turned out that many of them were in the same building, under the same address.
Yeah.
So there was nothing on my map except a whole bunch of points that was just on top of each other. And when you look at the map from above, it was not really interesting. So you needed to have some sort of thing where I could tilt it and see it as a bit of a...
Yeah, no, that's totally exactly what you can do. So particularly when you're dealing with points, but you can also deal that with polygons. And you can convert polygons to points using that centroid function I just showed you, right? We can say, okay, what's the centroid of each polygon, each area? Let's get its point. Now let's attach the data to these points. And then rather than using an elevation for your z, right? So an xy coordinate is if you would have a, you know, a function like this, right? If this is our box, you know, here you have your x, your y, and your z. This is a really messed up graph, but you get the picture, and this gives us our elevation in space. So you can then, for your elevation, rather than using meters, you can use events, right, or rates, and you can then look at it. One thing that they often do that with is in economics, right? Some of the classic bid rent models of cities from the 1920s in Chicago, when they were first looking at land prices within cities, they mapped these curves of land prices. That land prices were highest in the center and went down. And this is a 3-dimensional model of space. And we can do that with any of these things as well. And you can do it quite easily within ArcGIS, once you know the functions that exist, right? I can probably, you know, at some point tomorrow, if people are interested, to show you how to do that. It's not a super tricky thing how to do. Here's a spatial interpolation. This is point samples. This is using data on, let's say, rainfall data, and this is where you have each point which has a observed value, and then we can draw it up, and then we use what's called a spatial interpolation. So this is an actual mathematical model which creates a blanket over top of it of high values, and that's this 3-dimensional map that you get over top, where you get your x and y coordinate and put it up in space. And that's your z value. So, and then each one of these points has a value associated with it. When we convert this, you can see I don't know if you can see it very well here, but it looks like a lattice, right? It looks like it's a series of grids, and that's that raster grid that I was talking about. These are squares, right? And so then what it does is it actually interpolates the values of what would be in between these values. So we do this with air pollution, where we only have certain number of observations, throughout a city. Let's say we're doing a study of a city on air pollution. We might have 50 samplers. We have these points. We then create a continuous surface. So no matter where you live within the city, we can determine your likely air pollution exposure. Even though you might be in between these points, it would be on one of these surface cells. So that's sort of how we do it. And you can do these surface maps of all sorts of different things. Some really cool ones have been done of poverty, doing surface maps of poverty within the city. Crime, they do a lot of that in. So looking at crime hotspots. Stats Canada actually did some really good. They had a GIS guy working in the Centre for Justice Statistics, and he did these of all the various cities across Canada, and it was really cool. He found a better job in another division, but because he was by himself in Justice, so he's a little bit bored. But he found a good job in demography, where he gets to do some fun stuff with other people doing it. But so I'm now going to get just to briefly introduce mapping. And how we do that. I've just showed some examples of mapping. So a map is a collection of spatially defined objects and combines both the map and the scientific visualization methods. So how we represent this data is also a whole nother science and art unto itself. We can either approach it deductively. So we have a hypothesis that we want to test. We have a hypothesis about, let's say, health inequality, and we construct our hypothesis and then gather data and test our hypothesis. It's a deductive approach versus an inductive approach. We have a whole bunch of data set. Let's data mine this and generate hypotheses, a hypothesis generating activity. Anyone who's taken a stats course, this is the same argument you have, right? And an abductive approach where we discover the pattern along with the hypothesis and that interaction between the data and perception. So that's where mapping comes in, and we can sort of change these. This is a very famous map. Can you guys see the brown part here and then the black part? This is Napoleon's march on Moscow. And this is where people went and the number of soldiers when Napoleon marched to Moscow. And either people went off and left and disappeared, or they died at certain times. It was a very famous march because many people perished over the winter. You don't march on Moscow in the middle of the winter. And you can see that very few people actually made it back alive. Some people went off, some people escaped, and most people just perished along the way. So it's a very famous map that has a tremendous amount of information on it. It uses a lot of excellent cartographic techniques. It's powerful, it's visually stunning, and it presents a certain point of view. Each one of these things shows the elevation as well as the time when that occurred. So it has all this information associated within one. This is from Edward Tilley, his introduction to visualization. And brilliant books. If you want to look at just like beautiful coffee table books, buy some Edward Tilley books. He's got maps and charts and graphics, and they're just gorgeous. Absolutely, like they're just, you'll look at them and want to frame them on the wall because they're almost like abstract art, but they all have this tremendous amount of data information sitting behind it. I get excited about these sort of things. My wife does not. You bought another map off eBay? Chloropleth maps are one of the main types of maps that we see. It's the mapping content equivalent to a histogram. Each attribute category has a discrete spatial unit. We can choose different types of intervals and colors. So a chloropleth map looks like this. This is a city in Chile where I was working for my PhD. And each one of these is a city block. And this is looking at quintiles of poverty. So quintiles, there are 5 categories, 0 to 20, 30 to 40, the different poverty quintiles. We do the same thing here in Canada. We construct the different income quintiles and we produce that sometimes from Stats Canada. We produce that. People calculate it themselves. And then we can map those in space, showing where we get these areas in poverty. How we define these and how we color these can really change our interpretation of the map, right? If I colored these 0 to 20, so that was less poverty. If I colored those green and I colored the high poverty red, it would look much different and have a whole different visual display. We can also look at it as a standard deviational. So what's the deviation from the standard? You know, if we plot this on a normal distribution, let's look at this where we get the two extremes. So where we get the red areas are on the one extreme of the normal distribution, and the blue areas or the yellow areas are on the other extreme of the distribution. And we can then plot those looking at that. So our number of observations in category depends on the distribution of the data then, right? We could have, you know, a continuous color range. We could still have 5 categories for color and things like that. We can do cartograms. So this is a changing size reflecting something other than the area. So this might be the looking at the number of people who are in poverty versus the actual rate within that area. So let's look at the number of individuals who are in poverty. So we can then have larger dots for more people, smaller dots for less people. So we can do different things and display our data differently, and they then tell different stories. Whole nother aspect of GIS as to what we're doing. We're going to do just a very simple map at the end of it. You know, here are the municipalities of New Brunswick. Here are the major cities. Scale bar, north arrow, title, done. I'm going to give you data. You can actually do these other things if you want, but it's not required in the labs. The last thing I wanted to cover, we have a break at 2:30. So we've got about 25 minutes. I wanted to just cover the one last thing, and that's talking about Canadian spatial data and the StatsCan data. A lot of what we do for our data is based on the StatsCan geographic base, so standard geographical classification. And even the provincial data is often based on the standard geographical classification. Even our health regions have generally, the boundaries abide by those. And you know, there's obvious reasons for them. Biggest one being the census is collected based on this. We want to know what the population is within it, so it makes sense. StatsCan spends a lot of money doing it. Why recreate the wheel? Let them spend the money and not have everyone else spend the money. These sort of things. And I also want to talk about postal codes because some of you, one person here knows how to deal with postal codes. They are something that we often want to use as a geographic piece of geographic information. How many people have ever used postal codes as like a geographic information? Has anyone done it? Yeah.
I have to. I don't know how
You have to, and you don't know how to do it. Postal codes are an absolutely horrible piece of geographic information. They're not made for locating people in space. This is what I spend most of my time at StatsCan doing. They're made to deliver mail, right? That's what they're developed for, simply to deliver mail. But it's often all we have. It's usually all we have, right? So we got to do something with it. So the standard geographic, can everyone read these? Do you want me to make this bigger? I'm getting older, so I'm getting blinder too. Well, actually, I'm very blind without glasses. So this is the standard geographical classification from StatsCan as to how things are set up. The census subdivision sits here in the middle. There's a little over 5,000 of them. This is essentially a municipal equivalent. It's a little bit of a dynamic boundary. Census subdivision boundaries are updated in between the census periods, and there's usually updates done continuously, you know, on an annual basis, and StatsCan make those available. So this is sort of what you would call a municipal area. That is comprised of these things called dissemination areas, and that is the area at which information is disseminated. So this is the lowest, really the lowest area which census data is disseminated at. And that's the full set of census data with population counts, age and sex, and then what other census data. The National Household Survey, the 2011 NHS, the old long-form census is also disseminated at this level, and then at the census tract level. So the dissemination area is what things are done at. Dissemination block is one of our much smaller units. There's about 500,000 across Canada, and that's more equivalent to a city block. all you're going to get at that level is the population count and dwelling count. And even then it might be masked. So depending upon if it's less than 5, it may be randomly rounded, either to 0, or if it's 1, it might be rounded up to 5. So there's a random controlled rounding process that occurs there. Above that is this area called census tract, and this is equivalent to a neighborhood. So a neighborhood area would have a census tract. So one census tract, the University of New Brunswick is one census tract. Just south of here where I bought my house, along University Ave, over to the water, that little triangle, that's another census tract, right? It's a little neighborhood. So they generally follow neighborhood boundaries. There's been some academic research as to how one defines neighborhood and how does that influence our results. And strange enough, it found that the census tract is actually a very good way of defining neighborhoods. It uses a combination of population and physical features to define the boundaries. So you would have a highway or a major road or a water or something like that defining it. Change in land use from residential to industrial or commercial. These sort of things define the boundary. So it's a really good measure. And most of our data is disseminated at the census tract level within census metropolitan or census agglomeration areas. So there are 3 areas that this information is released at the census tract level within New Brunswick. The 3 main CMAs within New Brunswick really get that. And this, is where you're going to get most of this data. Right? So really you're going to get Fredericton, St. John, and Moncton is where you're going to get the census tract data for New Brunswick. And then outside of that area, they don't have census tracts. So for New Brunswick, the data I'm providing you is at the census subdivision level versus census tract level. But within a city, you may want to use a census tract if you're doing just looking within a city. These all fit within a hierarchy. So everything above dissemination blocks is comprised of it. The electoral districts, the dissemination block boundaries are coincident with it, right? Dissemination areas, census subdivisions. A dissemination area never crosses a boundary between one census subdivision and another. They're always, the boundary of one is always the boundary of another. They never go split them in between. There are these things sitting off here, postal codes. Notice postal code forward sortation areas, which are the first 3 digits of a postal code, the first 3 characters, right? The HOH or whatever, H0H. Those are only coincident with province boundaries. So they cross everything. A postal code, one postal code can cross a municipal boundary, it can cross a block face, it can cross a dissemination block, it can cross a census metropolitan area. There's one postal code that actually crosses, there used to be 30, but now there's only one as of this year that crosses provincial boundaries. So even that, it was only within Canada, right? There's only one now, and it's the federal government postal code within Ottawa. It's in Ottawa and Gatineau. So it's just the K1Y postal code, which is fine. No one has their own mail delivered to the federal government anyways. Yeah?
You know the income quartiles?
Mm-hmm. The income quintiles are calculated. We calculate those at the DA level. We have, on our postal code conversion file plus, PCCF plus, we have linked those via the dissemination area to the postal code. So we can, using a piece of software we have called PCCF plus, we can say which dissemination area postal code is related to and what the income quintile of that postal code is based on its dissemination area. So it's calculated at the DA level, or we calculate it at the CT level, various ways. There's different ways of calculating an income quintile. And we can relate it to the postal code via this translation file, which Ben took my PCCF plus training course at StatsCan. PHAC offered a training course, paid for a training course for their cancer registry people. And we've offered it as well at various times to other people in other government departments. So it's a file that allows you to get from postal codes to all these different standard geographical classifications. So because you have this issue where a postal code one postal code can cover multiple dissemination areas, it's not a one-to-one relationship. So if all you know is the postal code, that individual could live in one of anywhere between 1 and 20 dissemination areas. Yeah?
Can you create a centroid?
No. Not easily. Some postal codes are relatively easy, but 80% of postal codes relate within a dissemination block. About 80 dissemination area within Canada. So most urban postal codes, cover, if you think of your postal code, if you live in one of the major cities, either Fredericton or Moncton, most people I think are coming from, it's probably you and your neighbors on that same side of the street which have your postal code. Your neighbor across the street has a different postal code. Usually just the last character, usually just the last digit changes, right? So in that case, it's usually related to a block face. So just a portion of that block face, that side of that city block, right? You can relate it to. And we know that information at Stats Canada. Canada Post provides that to Stats Canada, who then relates it to this block face. So most of Canada is related at this level, but there's these like 23% of Canadian postal codes don't abide by those rules. They're just rebels. They hang out in this netherworld outside of that. So these could be PO boxes, these could be rural routes, which are postal codes cover huge areas. These could be fly-in communities that have a postal code and the mail is flown in for more than 6 months of the year. It could be brought in by a truck on ice roads. It could be any number of these sort of things, right? So each one of these different areas, most of rural New Brunswick, except Canada Post considers all of New Brunswick urban. Yeah, I know. Even though it's not. So you get these rural mailboxes where you drop off and they just deliver it to this mailbox system, which all of Canada is going to be moving to, right? So and everyone goes and picks them up at this mailbox collection area. So postal codes are really hard.
What's the aggregations of, I have a file which StatsCan brilliantly decided we were only going to get it by the first 3 digits. So is there a common aggregation?
The forward sortation area is the first 3 characters, and that's a publicly available data. That's free.
What you're talking about, the linkage to the income, whatever, how is the income part aggregated?
Income quintiles are aggregated at the dissemination area level, which doesn't correspond to forward sortation area boundaries. Forward sortation areas cross dissemination areas. So when we want to calculate an income quintile for a forward sortation area, we can only do a best guess. So, yeah, exactly. There's different ways of doing it, and you want to population weight it based on the population that's in there. And we have this whole software that's available that we developed within StatsCan to do just that. In the Health Analysis Division, Russell Wilkins is the person who developed it, and that's based on this 6-character, or we can even do it on a 3-character postal code. Because yeah, some data are only provided at the FSA. Quebec only releases any of its data outside of Quebec with the FSA, even to StatsCan. StatsCan doesn't get data from Quebec that we can use without the first 3 characters for most data sets, which is just, fair enough. Data confidentiality, it's their right to do it, but it makes analysis tricky. So it's something that you're going to want to get into, and if you have specific questions about your specific data set, I can help you with that, particularly what's related to postal codes, because I spend an inordinate amount of time doing that. So here's an example of just, should have shown this up before. So this is, if we're talking about postal codes, this could be, these could be different. So this is a boundary that you're considering. These are dissemination blocks. Each one of these is a dissemination blocks. Each one of these is a block face coordinate. We may be interested in these areas and these individuals within those areas. So we would have to use a GIS or some sort of system like that to select out these areas. The boundaries are not necessarily coincident with what we're looking at. So, and postal codes do this, where a postal code can cross these different boundaries. And that was the issue that we were talking about. So that's the last thing I wanted to do about this.